Hey everyone, glad to be talking with you again tonight about our question series. So, for the next several weeks, we're going to be spending time just answering your questions about God, the Bible, and how to live a Christian life. And last week, we kind of kicked off that series by talking about the racial issues. Originally, I was going to start with this message tonight, but it just seemed like there was so much going on with the protests and just the reaction to the death of George Floyd that I wanted to start with that question. But I want to kind of just address other kinds of questions now too. And I think you guys all know that asking questions about God and that kind of thing is really important to do because I'm sure you guys have lots of questions that you have just about all this stuff. But you might have questions that come from like about how can we know that the Bible is true, or how can we know that Jesus rose from the dead, or something like that. It's not that you don't believe those things, it's just that you would like some more reassurance about them. Or maybe you've told some of your friends about God and they have questions that you just don't know how to answer. And so you'd like to ask them so that you can talk to them better. And in fact, the Bible actually tells us that we should always have an answer for the reason of the hope that is in us. So in 1 Peter 3:15, it actually says, "But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect." So we're supposed to be able to make a defense to anyone who asks us for a reason. I don't think that means that we have to answer every single possible question that someone might ask. Right? That's actually impossible because there's so many potential questions people could ask. But I think it does mean that we need to be able to explain why we have hope in Jesus. And it means that we need to explain how Jesus is our source of our hope. And they might ask a little bit about why we believe that Jesus can give us hope. Now, it's possible that they'll ask a question that's either too hard or too weird, so we've never just thought about it before. So you might not know the answer. There are probably some questions that you can just expect people to have, and it's worth just learning the answers to those questions or thinking through them for yourself as well. And you don't have to just be me teaching you, but hopefully I can help guide you to those answers. And it's worth saying that for some questions that people ask, there might not be a super duper clear answer. And that's okay. Like, there could be some Christians who answer it one way and some Christians who answer it a different way. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that the Bible is not true. It just means that, well, actually, there's more than one way that it could be true in some cases. And we might really wish that we could figure out God completely, but that's not a realistic thing for us, right? So we're not going to know everything. He's infinite, and we are just finite, right? He's just too big for us to fully understand. So since we're not going to fully understand him or know everything about him, we have to kind of accept that. Now, sometimes people might look at that and think that our inability to answer questions is somehow a sign that the whole thing is false. Like if we can't answer every single question about God, then God must not exist, right? Um, for some reason, the idea is like if we're unable to fully understand or fully explain everything, then that means that religion isn't true or that Christianity isn't true. Now, before we even start to talk about that, I just want to point out real quickly that usually when people say that, they're like religion versus science, right? And they'll be like, well, science answers questions. Why can't religion answer every question? Well, I just want to point out that science can't answer every question, right? Science has not fully explained everything either. It just hasn't, right? Sometimes there's progress in science, but there's also progress in knowing God better, right? People have come to know God better and understand the Bible better. Usually that happens when God reveals something new to us, but we can make progress even just understanding it. It's just not always as easy to confirm as science, and some people will disagree sometimes, et cetera, but that doesn't mean it isn't real. And science, like just as an example, doesn't explain everything. So, as recently as 2006, science couldn't explain how bees could fly. They're like, bees are flying, but we don't know how the wings that are that small can make an animal that big fly. They've now figured it out, but it's kind of surprising to realize that just less than 15 years ago, we were like, bees fly, I guess. I don't know how. So while science, today still has a theory of how life evolved, it hasn't figured out how it began and has a theory of how the universe sort of exploded in the Big Bang Theory, but they don't know why. it exploded or why there was anything that could explode or anything like that. And then there's other science that's way above my head about like string theory and that kind of stuff. They haven't figured that out either. And see, I wouldn't expect science to necessarily be able to do that. Maybe it'll figure out some things in there, maybe it won't, or maybe it'll come up with a theory that it believes, even if it's false. But the God who designed everything, right? He's just smarter than us and can create things that we don't understand. And so when God creates a life or something like that, we might be able to create theories afterwards, but he might have done it in a way that wasn't explainable by science. And we might, so science might try to come up with things but never really arrive because it's looking in the wrong place. But even with that, that doesn't mean that it's not important to ask the questions, both in science and in theology, the study of God, right? We can't know in advance before we start asking the questions what things we will know how to explain and what things we won't know how to explain, right? And just because we seem to be reaching a dead end as we move along doesn't mean that we can't keep trying. Like Proverbs 25:2 says, "It is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings is to search things out." So basically, in that verse, God says that it's his glory to not let us fully understand him, but it's glorious for us to try to understand him, to pursue those answers. So I think what that means is that we should continue to search for these answers and never fully give up, whether those are questions of science or of the faith. Like all of those things are things that God has hidden and that we get to try to figure out, right? It's just part of the way God has designed us. We're curious, and it's great to try to find out the things that God has concealed. We just can't expect to know everything because God knows everything and we don't. So let's not hold belief in God to some standard where we have to understand everything in order to choose to believe, because that's not a standard that will really allow us to believe anything, including science. We'll just have to say, oh, I don't know. I mean, how can I prove it? And that's not really a path that we can realistically go down, of just pretending like, well, I don't know that you exist. What if I'm just dreaming? Right? You're not. This is real, right? Anyway, so instead, what I want to try and convince you of, if you aren't already convinced, is that Christianity better fits the evidence in the world than any other religion or non-religion, like science. Right? I think that Christianity teaches the truth about God and humanity, and I think that the evidence points most clearly in that direction. Okay? And if you have any questions about that, I want to try and help you answer them, right? After all, we are told that we should make disciples of all nations in Matthew 28, verses 19 and 20. And it will be hard to do that, to make disciples of all people, if we cannot really help people to see how Christianity could be true. So I do want to remind you of 1 Peter 3:15 and just remind you that when you start talking to other people about Jesus, and when we give a defense of the faith, we have to do it with all gentleness and respect. So what that means is that we've got to realize that it's actually more important that you treat another person kindly than that you make your point accurately, right? I've had had discussions with where like the other person maybe starts to get a little bit hostile and angry, but because I don't get hostile or angry in response, and I have a sense of like, okay, I just can still stay calm and respectful, it eventually comes back into being a good conversation. Like I have one particular conversation in mind that I had with a person that I didn't actually really know, but the person seemed to be getting a little angry while I was kind of calmly presenting the gospel and answering their questions. They would seem like they're a little bit, I don't know. And so when I was having this conversation, it was also with one of his friends who was a Christian, and he was like, "Hey, is this like bothering you? Like, what's going on? Are you upset?" And he was like, "No, like actually, that person, this speaking to me, like he's actually being really surprisingly respectful. He's not." Which I knew I was being respectful, but I wasn't 100% sure if he was receiving it that way. So it was really good just to hear him saying like, "Oh yeah, no, he's actually being really surprisingly respectful. I actually, this is a good conversation." So we kept talking and I kept answering his questions, and he was like, "I guess like that makes sense, blah, blah, blah." But then he finally revealed the reason why he doesn't believe in God. And the real reason for him was that his mom died when he was younger, and his dad wasn't really ready to take care of him as a single dad. And he kind of felt like if God is real, like, well, that wasn't okay for God to let that happen. And so he was angry at God if God exists, or God just doesn't exist, and that's why this kind of happened. So that was really what was going on with him. And because I was, respectful towards him, he was able to share that with me. And then I had a chance to try and reassure him and stop talking about an intellectual defense of the faith, because that wasn't really where he was at, right? That wasn't the big problem. It wasn't that questions, abstract questions couldn't be answered. It was really, he had gone through a really hard thing in his life. And so I wish I could say that, like, afterwards he decided to believe, or that I was even able to keep in touch with him or find out how things were going with him. But I wasn't able to do that. I wasn't able to get like contact information to keep talking. But I was still able to give a reason for my hope and let him know that even if he didn't feel like God cared, like I cared as a Christian. And I think he could see that. And so I found out like he wasn't really angry with me, but he was kind of angry with God. And I was able to begin to address that just because I chose to be not defensive, but just to really be respectful towards him. And so all of that, though, is evidence of something that's really more important, right? About how we come to believe things. We don't usually get people to decide to become Christians by winning arguments about the existence of God, right? In that conversation, I won the arguments, I guess. Not that I was like focused on that, but I answered his questions and he didn't have anything to say. But that didn't make him become a Christian, because it's a bigger deal than just that. We can probably prevent people from becoming Christians by losing arguments. If we just like, oh, I don't know anything, but I just believe, right? A lot of people will just be like, oh, I don't believe. But in general, I think that what convinces people to become Christians is that our lifestyles are different. And answering those questions kind of helps them to begin the process of considering it. Because people need to see that we really are loving. They need to experience that Christianity really makes a difference in your own lives more than anything else. And I think that was probably what made the most impact on the person that I was talking with that day. And I think that if you ever talk with people about God, then the way that you talk and the kind of person that you are will probably make even a bigger impact than whatever you have to say. And now, of course, some of these questions that you might have aren't really about what I'm talking about right now at all. Right? I've been talking almost entirely about the idea of like intellectual questions about God and the Bible and why is it true. You just might want to know how you're supposed to handle a certain situation according to the Bible. Like, how do I actually live my life? Maybe you just don't know whether you should get a tattoo or not, or how to handle a situation where people are gossiping and you don't know how to both like not participate in gossip, but also not come across as super judgy. Like, you just don't know how to get out of that situation, right? And those kinds of questions are actually really important too, right? They help us grow as Christians and to be faithful to Christ. And that's what our goal is to be faithful to Christ. And yeah, honestly, if we answer those questions well, that'll actually help us to do the stuff with gentleness and respect that I was talking about. We'll be better at making disciples if we've learned how to be respectful of other people, to the point that people actually look at us and they want to be like us because they see that we've done a good job of asking questions and about how to live the Christian life and actually are living that way, right? It's no good to answer these questions and then decide, meh, I'm just going to do things my way, obviously. So please, I just want to encourage you guys to think of any questions that you have about how you can grow in your faith and live in a way that honors God. I want to tackle those questions. That's kind of like the questions that we tackled last week with the racial issues. Those questions are really important. And again, these questions can also be hard for a lot of reasons. For one reason why these questions can be hard is it can be hard to specifically understand your situation and the people that you might be dealing with. Like, we might know that we're called to reconcile and called to peace or something like that in general, but depending on the people that you're talking about, what would be normally good advice about how to pursue that might not work. Like, I can think of one time in my life where I got advice from a lot of people that was, I think, generally good advice, but because I was dealing with people who weren't maybe normal in their reactions to things, it didn't work. Because I remember having some roommates who were just really hard to reconcile with and really hard to talk to about anything because they just really, really, really did not like conflict, right? So these roommates had made a big mess in our front yard to the point where the neighbors were complaining, coming over and being like, "Hey, can you guys clean this up? Like, this is gross. This is bad." Um, and I asked, like, "Hey," because it was their mess, like, "Hey, can we clean this up? Do you like, you say you still want all this stuff? Can we like not have it sitting out in our front yard?" What their reaction was that they yelled at me and then they didn't talk to me for 3 days and then pretended like nothing had ever happened after those 3 days. And I knew before I went into talking with them that this probably wouldn't work, but other people thought that it would. Like I could just kind of try to bring it up just a little bit. Um, and they thought like, oh, that's a totally normal thing to ask. Like if there's a mess, asking someone to clean it up. But they just didn't understand what my roommates were like and how they would respond to something like that. Because they were just people who would get easily overwhelmed and emotionally shut down at the slightest hint of criticism or asking you to do anything. It's just like, I can't handle it. I'm going to yell and I'm going to run away from you for as long as I can. So, trying to figure out what to do in those kinds of situations where people aren't necessarily responding the way that you or the way that other people would expect people to respond can make it hard to figure out what the right thing to do is, right? For that reason, some of your questions could be tough to answer, right? What I'll try to do is give you guidance about the things that you can think through because you know your situation better than me, so that you can make your own decisions. And I also trust that the Holy Spirit, who's working inside of you, can help you to make the right choice. And in doing that, you'll have a chance to show the hope that you have in Christ so that people can see him and glorify him. But just by combining how to answer those intellectual questions about God and the Bible with questions about how to live your life in response to God, then we can become a more effective witness for the gospel to the rest of the world. And we'll get a chance to tell people about Jesus, and we will deepen our own faith so that we can come to know God better and experience the joy that comes from walking in God's presence. So the questions we're going to discuss today is just, what did I say are the main kinds of questions that we'll be trying to talk about? And the second one is, why do you think questions are important to ask? And the third one is just, do you have any questions that you'd like to ask in this series? And then I'll make my next videos maybe about your question. Anyway, I'm looking forward to talking with you guys and hope to talk with you soon. Bye.